In this lesson, we're going to take a look at UVs in ZBrush. UVs are coordinates that allow you to wrap a two-dimensional texture around a three-dimensional object. So it will allow us to take this poly-painted skin texture and then bake that down into a two-dimensional image, which can then be wrapped around our 3D mesh outside of ZBrush, say in Maya, Unreal Engine, any other software that will load in a 3D model with UV coordinates. It's pretty much the standard way of applying a texture in 3D. You need to have UV coordinates to do that. So let's take a look at how to create them. ZBrush has a variety of ways of creating automated UVs. So if we look under Tool, UV Map, here you can see we've got these options here. We've got Morph UV, Delete UV. If I click Delete UV, that will actually delete any UV coordinates I happen to have on my mesh. I can set my resolution. I'll set it to 4K. We'll leave the UV map border alone at 2 pixels, and we'll open up Create. Now this allows us to create various UV coordinates. We have cylindrical, spherical, planar. These are all your standard sort of UVs. Now down here we've got AUV, PUV, and GUV tiles. This is adaptive UV tiles, packed UV tiles, and group UV tiles. These are the ZBrush automated UVs that are not human readable. Now, for example, if I click AUV tiles, what I'll need to do is be at my lowest subdivision level to apply any UVs. So I'm going to step down to level 1. We'll go back here to UV map create, and I'm going to create AUV tiles. Now it doesn't appear that anything happened, but now I've got Morph UV. It's activated again. So if I click Morph UV, this will actually morph my mesh into the UV coordinates. So what we have here is every single face is getting its own UV space. So this is filling out the entire 4K texture map with UVs. So this takes full advantage of the entire 4K map, but the drawback to this, as you can see, is it's not human readable. If I wanted to open this map in Mari or in Photoshop and then paint on it in a flat UV space, I couldn't do that. I couldn't actually see what I'm looking at. So we'll unmorph the UV. So that can be a really effective, fast UV solution. But again, the major drawback is I can't actually see it. And that's really important if you want to do any hand painting or any editing on top of your UV. AUV tiles gives me the UV that you just saw. PUV tiles, if we take a look at this is called packed UV tiles. So this packs based on texture density. And if I unmorph my UV, and then I'll write over it with group UV tiles, and then morph UV. Here we're getting some larger regions combined with some smaller regions. Again, none of these are human readable. So in a pinch, these are okay, but since these were introduced, there's actually a better way of generating UVs inside of ZBrush. It's a plugin called UV Master. So every once in a while, I might put some AUV tiles on something and use those for a UV. But for the most part, I'm going to use this tool here. If we go to Z Plugin and then open this by clicking the little radial icon and open up UV Master, here you can see we've got a UV plugin. Now this is also automated UVs, but the UVs generated by UV Master are human readable. So the first button that we want to click anytime we're loading up UV Master is Work on Clone. And that will clone our mesh, and basically we no longer have subdivision levels on this clone, and it allows us to apply UVs to this. You can see I still have my original head here, but here's the clone that we're going to use with UV Master. So I'll leave symmetry turned on. That gives me symmetrical UV islands, and I'm just going to go ahead and click Unwrap. Now that's going to process, and it won't look like anything has happened, but if I come over here and turn on Check Seams, now it's going to display this orange line. This orange line is a visual cue of where my UV seam has been placed by UV Master. If I click Flatten, it will flatten that UV island out. So you see I'm getting a seam that's running straight down the center of the face. So I'll click Unflatten. So that's not ideal. So what I'll do now is I'll turn on Enable Control Painting, and I will click Protect, And now my brush has turned into a paintbrush, and I'll turn my X symmetry on, and I can paint red into those areas where I don't want there to be a UV seam. So I'll paint that down here, and then we'll unwrap again. Because I have check seams still turned on, you see once again it shows me the seams. And if I go to flatten, this will show me my flattened UV seams. So let's go a step further. If I go into frame mode, you see I've got polygroups on this head. I've got polygroups for the ears and polygroups for the antenna. Now, I can get a better UV if I slice these out and make these separate UV islands. UV islands are any separate shells like this. This is an island and this is an island. These are two UV islands. So if I turn on polygroups, this tells UV Master to slice and make a UV island out of these individual polygroups. So I'll leave polygroups turned on. I'll go back to my control painting and I've got protect turned on. Let's turn frame mode off so it's a bit easier to see. I'm going to go ahead and just make a really bold statement by painting red all over the whole front and back here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and paint protect all the way through here. Let's make sure that we're getting red on everything. So at this stage, I'm telling ZBrush, don't put a seam anywhere. Now, obviously, it's not going to be able to accommodate that, but I can change from protect control painting to attract control painting. And now that's going to paint the color blue. So if I click and drag, I'm painting blue. Now the blue region is basically telling ZBrush, go ahead and put a seam here. And I'm going to bring this all the way up to the top of the head. Let's go back to protect, and then I can actually narrow that a little bit. I don't want to try and be too specific. I don't want to paint exactly where I want the seam to be because ZBrush is basically going to do its best to give me a UV that respects my control painting, but also doesn't give me distortion. So it's gonna split the difference between what I'm asking for with this control painting and what it can actually produce. So here we go. I have a blue stripe down the back here. I'm going to Control-Shift-Click on these antenna polygroups. And now I'll just turn on X symmetry here. And I'm going to go ahead and just say, see if you can't put a seam down the back of the antenna like that. Control-Shift-Click on the background to reveal all, and then I will unwrap again. Now this time I have polygroups turned on, so it's going to automatically create new shells for the ears and the antenna, and look at that. We're getting a nice clean seam right down the back of the head and around the base of the antenna and a seam along the back of the antenna. So if I go to flatten, here you can see the resulting UV. So I'll unflatten. Now I need to get the UV off of this cloned object, off of this proxy mesh onto my original. So to do that, I'm going to click copy UVs, and that copies the UVs into memory. And then I'll switch back over to my original Z tool, and I will go ahead and click paste UVs. So I've now pasted those UVs into this Z tool, and this has to be at level 1, at the lowest subdivision level. So now if I morph UV, here you can see I'm getting that new UV. So once we've got our UVs on the head, what do we do with them? Well, we'll use these as a basis to bake in our polypaint. So if we go back up to our geometry and step up to the highest subdivision level, you know that polypaint is a per vertex color painting solution. So basically each vertex has its own RGB value. Now, while it is possible to export vertex color and you can import and view vertex color in other programs, it's not the ideal for pipeline use. We really do want to have our texture map baked out into a readable map. We want our polypaint baked out into a proper texture map. And to do that, we step up to our highest subdivision level, and then we come down. Let's close out of UV map, and we'll open up texture map. And under texture map, we have a create submenu here, and we have new from polypaint. So I will click new from polypaint, and as long as I'm at the highest subdivision level, it will bake out that texture into the new UV set. There we have it. Now, as you see in the chapter on getting our work out of ZBrush, we can potentially leave our texture map in here in the swatch here under the tool menu. And then if we use GoZ, it will export and link that texture map automatically to any GoZ enabled application like Maya, for example. But ideally, you want to know how to get your texture map out of ZBrush. So to do that, we're going to click the Clone Texture button here because this texture palette, this exists just under the Z tool. I want to get this into the main texture palette here. So to do that, I click Clone Texture, and here you see it's cloned right there. So from here, I can export. Now, it's worth mentioning that ZBrush's texture space is flipped in V from Maya, meaning it's flipped vertically. So you may want to just go to your texture menu, make sure you've got the texture map selected, and very simply hit Flip V. And that flips the map vertically. And then from there, you can export this and save it to disk. So let's go ahead and move it over here, and we'll save this as color texture, or let's say diffuse color. And then you can save that as a JPEG, PSD, PNG, or TIFF file. So I'll save it as a TIFF. So diffuse color, TIFF, and save. So I've now saved that out. Now, while I have this texture swatch activated, if I were to come in here and try and poly paint on this character, so I'll select the standard brush, and let's just go to Alpha 1, and we'll select color. Maybe I want to paint bright red on my character. Make sure that my brush is set to RGB, Z-add is turned off, and then if I start painting, it doesn't appear that anything's happening. Well, that's because this texture is on. Think of this texture as being an overlay on top of your poly paint. If I turn the texture off, now I'll be able to paint. Let's undo that, or we'll leave that on here. I'll put that red swatch on there. If I turn texture on, you see it goes away. That's because the texture is displaying on top of the poly paint. So undo that. So that's very important to remember. All the different types of texture maps which can be generated from your Z tool actually have their own swatches here, which we will talk about more in our chapter on getting our work out of ZBrush. But just to mention it right now, there's a normal map swatch, which looks very similar to the texture map swatch. We also have a displacement map, very similar. So any texture map that's color, displacement, or normal that we want associated with a Z tool can actually be linked with the individual palettes under the tool menu. And these do save when you save a Z tool. So it's good to know that if you have a texture that's actually associated with your Z tool, it will save. So let's take a look now at what we would do if you want to lay out your UVs outside of ZBrush entirely. Maybe you're very confident laying out UVs in Maya or Hedis UV or any number of other tools. Well, that's not a problem. We can import those UVs directly into ZBrush. So here I've got my Hellhound model on screen. If we come down to the UV map submenu, and I'm going to step down a couple subdivision levels so we can morph UV and it'll go a little bit faster. You can actually morph UV while you've got subdivisions active. So if I morph UV, here you can see I've laid out these UVs automatically in a single UV region or UDIM. Also notice that the sculpting is visible if I'm at a higher subdivision level while I'm in flattened UV mode. So take note of that because that'll come into play later on. So let's unmorph the UV. So what I want to do is I want to send this model to Maya. And if I go up to the top of the tool menu, there's this button here called GoZ. Now what GoZ does is it will automate the process of linking between ZBrush and any other GoZ enabled application like Maya or 3D Studio Max. So when I click GoZ, it will take my currently selected subtool, step it down to the lowest subdivision level, export it, then open, in this case, Maya, and then load it in and set my scene up for me. And it creates a live link between ZBrush and Maya. So I can do things like change the model, I can change my UVs, and then automatically bring it back across. So when I click GoZ, it's going to pop up with this continue window, and I'll just go ahead and click continue. Now, the first time you load this, it may ask you, or it will ask you for the path to your GoZ enabled application. So you'll just browse to your executable for Maya or 3D Studio Max, whatever program you happen to be using. I want to also point out that there are two other buttons there. There's all and visible. If I click all, it will export all of my subtools. And if I click visible, it sends just the visible subtools. But in this case, I just want to send my active Z tool. So I just click the standard GoZ button. So in the background, Maya is loading. Let's switch over to that now. And once GoZ completes, this is what you'll see. You'll have your model loaded up into the Maya viewport. We'll have a variety of selection sets and the mesh here. If I go to the UV editor, we'll just see on this particular model, we've got the automatic mapping that was accomplished with the UV master. It's all packed into one UDIM here. So I just want to make a quick change to the UVs on this mesh just to show you how quick and easy it is to transfer any changes back over into Maya. So I'm just going to take these existing islands, scale them up, and then spread them out across multiple UDIMs or UV regions, as it were. So let's take a look at that. Now here you see we've altered the UVs. I've actually scaled them up and spread them out across multiple UDIMs. So I just wanted to make a very obvious change to the UVs on the mesh. Now, selecting the mesh, we'll just click the Go Z button, and that will send our model back to ZBrush and incorporate these changes. So let's see that happen now. Now, it may not appear that anything's happened. However, if I come down here and go to UV Map, click Morph UV, our UVs morph, but it looks like everything's stacked up on top of itself. And the reason for that is ZBrush by default only sees the first UV region. It only sees everything in the UDIM 1001 or 0 to 1 UV range. We'll talk more about that when we get to the chapter on getting our models and getting our maps out of ZBrush. But suffice to say, fear not, you can actually export displacement and texture map across multiple UDIMs using the multi-map exporter, which we'll talk about later. But any change that we want to make to our UV, we can do in Maya and then simply use that Go Z button to bring it back over into ZBrush. If I want to see those UVs more clearly, I can go back to my Z plugin, go to UV Master, click Work on Clone, and now when I flatten UVs, it will show me the flattened UVs. So I can actually see it outside of that default region. So unflatten, and that brings the model back into its position with its UV seams highlighted with orange. So let's come back over here to our Hellhound, and whenever you use the UV master, it will often change your shader to the skin shader here. I'm just going to switch it back to my startup material and then step back up my subdivision levels. So now we've seen how to create automatic mapping in ZBrush using the most basic tools, the AUV, GUV tiles. We've looked at how to create automatic mapping using UV Master and how to actually customize that further by relying on polygroups and control painting. We've also seen how we can use GoZ to pop over to Maya or Max or any other GoZ enabled application and then manually make changes to our UVs and then bring those back over to ZBrush. So before we close, I want to talk about one more thing that you can use UVs for in ZBrush that's actually quite neat. That's going to rely on the Morph UV flattening our mesh. So let's take a look at that now. Here you can see I've got a costume element on screen. It's just a form-fitting shirt with a hex tile pattern down the sleeves. It's kind of a superhero costume top. So let's say I wanted to sculpt a seam that ran from the shoulder down the arm. Now I could take, for example, my damn standard brush and then try and trace where I want that seam to run, like so. I could also take a standard brush or even take one of the stitching brushes, B for brush, S for stitch, and grab maybe Stitch Basic. And then I could use that and try and trace that line along using Lazy Mouse. However, there is another way that we can go about doing this. So at my highest subdivision level, in this case it's level 5, so it's only 900,000 faces or so, I'm going to come back down here to Morph UV. Click Morph UV, and because we have UVs on this mesh, I can flatten these islands down. So you see what's happening here. We can actually see our flattened UVs, but we can also see our sculpting on there. And as a matter of fact, I can, if I go back to Z add on my brush here, I can sculpt here in this flattened view. So if I morph UV, come back to this view, let's just make a little mark here. I'm going to take my standard brush, go to RGB, switch to black. I want my seam to run from here, just making a little mark for myself as a visual cue. I want it to run from here to here, like so. And I'll do the same thing on this side here. I want my seam to run from here to here. There we go. And now I'm going to morph UV. So here I have flattened out my view, and you can see I've got, let's move my light. I'm going to go to my light menu and just move this light forward so it's very easy to see. And you see my little marks here that I've used. So I'll go to the damn standard brush. I'll click on my first mark here, press the shift key and drag, and this gives me a straight line, and I get my degrees as that little white number there. I'm just going to bring this down to about here. I'll let go of shift, and then that's going to draw that line straight along that path. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I can drag from here, click, press shift, drag, and I'm just going to drag that to my other guide point that I painted right there, and then let go. And I can use my adjust last slider if I want to change the depth of that particular stroke there, if I want to increase that. And let's say while I'm here, I want to do some further sculpting. Maybe I want to do some sculpting on the flat right here. Maybe I will use my damn standard and just carve out a little line here, a little line here. Maybe go to my standard brush, go back to Z add, and maybe I want to build up some wrinkles here. And I can also smooth in this view as well, just holding down the shift key, just like you would smooth in your regular sculpting view. When you're finished sculpting, click Morph UV, and that returns to the three-dimensional view. Now, anything that you have sculpted or painted when you were flattened out in the Morph UV view is going to still be visible because it is actually in the color or the sculpt of the mesh. So here you see the deeper seam that we created along this line here. So it's following exactly between those two marker points that I placed there. So it's a very, very nice way to carve in like seams or buckles or construction lines or panels, anything that would be easier to do in a flat view than in a three-dimensional view. You can use Morph UV to do that. I find it really nice because I enjoy painting on a flattened UV view in Mari, for example. So this allows me to paint on a flattened UV view in ZBrush, giving me a lot of that same functionality. So we don't only have to use this for costumes and props. We can also use this on organic characters. Let's go back to our alien. And let's say I want to do some sculpting on the flat. So we've got 3 million polygons here. Maybe I'll step down a subdivision level just to make things a little bit easier. And I will do a Morph UV. So here we've got our mesh morphed. I'll take, let's say, a standard brush. And we'll select Alpha 57 is one that I really like. We'll go to our Alpha and we'll invert that. Turn our draw size up, and then I'll just hold down the Alt key and I can start sculpting that skin texture right on the side of the head here. Let's go ahead and turn our draw size up a bit. There we go. And I'll turn my draw size up again so it's even more apparent. It's your standard ZBrush navigation while you're in this view. So if you find that the subtools are in your way, of course you can always turn on solo. So holding down the Alt key. Oops. There we go. We can get a bigger sort of skin waffling pattern here. Now bring it right up to that edge. Holding down the Alt key. And then we will Morph UV. And here you can see that texture is right there where we sculpted it. So Morph UV can actually be quite handy when it comes to texturing or sculpting. You can paint or you can sculpt in that flat view. Let's do some painting into the flat. I'm going to go ahead and Morph UV again, and let's bring this back to a flat view. And I'm going to change to B for brush, D for deco, and I'm going to select either the deco curve dot or curve drag dot brush. And I'll change my alpha to a alpha 1 on this, and let's grab like a dark purple. Make sure RGB is turned on, and make sure that we don't have a texture map turned on because that's going to hide any poly paint we do. So using this brush, let's create some like war paint here. I'll do a little marking that runs down the sides of the face like this. There we go. Maybe I want that to be much, much smaller. So I'm going to turn my draw size down. So let's do draw size. Let's turn this down. And then we'll drag that. Now, if I don't like the result, I can always undo. And if I want to get rid of my curve, I'll just go to Stroke and under Curve, Functions, Delete. And that deletes that curve. So we'll draw a new one. We'll draw a curve that runs down the sides of the head and here. And there we go. And then we'll draw another one. Now, if my UVs were symmetrical, meaning they ran straight down the center line, I could use X symmetry in this view as well. So let's do another view here. We'll just consider this to be like an asymmetrical tribal marking here. And we'll do another one like this. And maybe I'll turn my draw size down. And maybe I want to do some around the cheek here. Something like that. And we'll do another one here. This will be really tricky because it's going to run all in those nooks and crannies of the brow line there. And here we can do some in the mouth area here. Let's do one there, and we'll do one here. And then we'll do run straight down this way. There we go. And then when I'm happy with that, I'll just go back to UV and unmorph. And here you can see those strokes conform and wrap around the surface in a way that would be really tricky to do. That stroke would be really hard to do from either one of these views because it goes under the chin, under the jawline. You know, these marks here go inside and wrap around the brow. So these are all a bit tricky to do. It's going to be hard to get strokes like that if you are trying to do them in 3D view here. Let's do one more. Run this one right down there. Drag that out. And then we will morph UV. And there you see, once again, that stroke, if you were to trace that stroke, it would be really difficult to get that all the way under that jawline and tapering down here. So it's not just for sculpting, it's not just for painting, it's not just for costume. You can utilize Morph UV and painting and sculpting in the flat on a variety of different applications. So it's just good to know that this is available to you. So that completes this look at UVs in ZBrush. We've seen how to create automatic UVs using AUV tiles and GUV tiles and PUV tiles. We've also seen how to create more human-readable UVs automatically using UV Master. We've seen how to customize UV Master using polygroups and control painting, and we've also seen how to use GoZ to send our models over to Maya if we want to do some custom tweaks to our UVs and then update them by sending them back into ZBrush. We've also seen how we can use our flat UV view to accommodate sculpting and painting strokes that would be otherwise tricky to do in a 3D view. So I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next lesson.